Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Guanche. I'm with the Department of Recruitment and Admissions in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at NSU, and I'm happy that you're here to join us today for this webinar about the Cuban Missile Crisis with Dr. David Kilroy. So throughout the course of this hour, we're going to hear Dr. Kilroy's presentation, and then we will take your questions on the subject. And then after that, we're going to talk for a few minutes about our master's program in National Security Affairs and International Relations and everything you need to know about the admissions process for that. So as a brief introduction, Dr. David Kilroy teaches in our undergraduate and graduate programs in the Department of History and Political Science, and has authored several books and numerous journal articles. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to him so we can get started. And as someone of Cuban descent, I'm very keen to hear about this part of my people's history. So I hope you are as interested as I am. All right, the show is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so hi, everybody. I am Dr. David Kilroy, and I teach in the Department of History and Political Science. I'm also the graduate director for our National Security Affairs program. And so I'm going to talk to you today for a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then hopefully we can have some Q&A on that topic. So I basically have a fairly straightforward presentation here. Hopefully now you can all see my slides. So this presentation is significant, I think, as an introduction to national security affairs at NSU for two reasons. One, it is a classic kind of case study in national security affairs and crisis management. And secondly, of course, here in South Florida, we are just 90 miles away from Cuba. We have a very large Cuban population. As Chris intimated, many people on campus are of Cuban descent. And in fact, given our proximity and the broad interest, we are, as part of the program next semester, doing a class which involves a travel component on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So several of our students and I will be going down to Havana as we study the Cuban Missile Crisis next semester. So that's just kind of a taste of some of the kind of programming and coursework that we have in the National Security Affairs program. So, as I say, this is basically a fairly straightforward review of this crisis. And what I want to do is highlight for you the kinds of things we would do in a larger discussion on this topic. And I think one of the things that we would begin with in any examination of the Cuban Missile Crisis is providing historical context. Right? So, in order to understand these 13 days in October 1962, in which the world came basically as close as it's ever been to nuclear Armageddon, we have to understand the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And then we have to understand the relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union and see the Soviet-US relationship through those different paradigms. So very briefly, the United States has been involved in Cuba really going back into the 19th century. There's a long period in which the US looked to Cuba as a possible 51st state, or in that, in the 19th century, anywhere from mid-30s up to the 50s. But there was talk of annexing Cuba. There was certainly a desire on the part of many Americans to incorporate it into the United States. In 1898, the U.S. Helped defeat Spain as a colonial power in North America and drive them out of Cuba and helped to liberate the country. But for all intents and purposes, Cuba served as a U.S. protectorate. The U.S. Exercised hegemony over Cuba really for the next 40 or 50 odd years. So, for example, after defeating the Spanish, the United States inserted into its budget in 1901 something called the Platt Amendment, which was later inserted into the first Cuban Constitution. This amendment gave the United States the right to intervene at will in Cuban affairs. This was part of a larger pattern we see in this period as the United States established a hegemonic, almost imperialistic relationship with the countries of the Caribbean and Central America under what is often referred to as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. claimed the authority or the right to intervene in the affairs of the region. The U.S., of course, built the Panama Canal and made this region a strategically vital area militarily and economically. Over the course of the next several decades, the United States invested heavily in Cuba, both in terms of political interest, but also private investors. The U.S., of course, established a permanent military or naval base at Guantanamo Bay, and the United States supported successive governments, including the government which Fidel Castro would overthrow in 1959, the government of Fulgencio Batista. Castro came to power in 1959 after a successful revolution, which began really out of a broader reaction against U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. The United States, after World War II, created the Organization of American States and promised not to intervene any further in the affairs of Latin America. But pretty soon, because of the Cold War and because of fear of communism spreading into the region, the United States began to intervene regularly, perhaps most famously in Guatemala in 1954, where the CIA helped overthrow the government and replace it with a more pro-U.S. regime. It's out of this context that people like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro emerge as kind of icons of a kind of anti-Yankee, anti-American populist ideology. And Castro and Che, of course, were at the forefront of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So from the very beginning in the United States, there are questions about Castro, about his motives. And in the context of the Cold War, where the United States was locked in this big struggle with the Soviet Union, combating what it saw as a global communist threat, Castro became an object of some suspicion, and a lot of people in the United States government, let me just go back to that previous slide, suspected him of strong communist sympathies. I think that's open to question, but certainly his views towards the United States were quite hostile from the beginning. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. Kennedy, as a very young and inexperienced president, was determined to show that he was a committed Cold Warrior, determined to fight communism, but also a kind of an idealist who wanted to advance a better image of the United States worldwide. Kennedy comes into office at a time when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, is trying to reshape Soviet policy, in particular exert greater Soviet influence in places like Latin America and the so-called developing world. So Kennedy and Khrushchev from the very beginning get locked in this kind of very confrontational personal struggle, which was exemplified by their, by the Vienna summit in 1961, where Khrushchev admonished Kennedy and made him feel very vulnerable. So from the very beginning, the United States was determined to remove Fidel Castro because they saw him as a threat to their interests in such a vital strategic area. The Eisenhower administration in the 1950s had developed covert operations tactics using the CIA, where they had inserted themselves in regimes around the world to overthrow governments which they feared would ally with the Soviet Union. So I mentioned Guatemala in 1954. The U.S. helped overthrow a government in Iran as well, in the Middle East in 1953, which they feared was pro-Soviet. And then when Kennedy comes into office, he puts into operation a plan which Eisenhower had begun, run by the CIA, which results in the the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. So the CIA, together with Cuban exiles, sought to overthrow Castro, failed badly, and this was very much a black mark on Kennedy, and added to a sense that he was on the defensive. Kennedy and the CIA then carried out a series of operations under the broad umbrella of what's called Operation Mongoose, in an effort to try to oust Castro from power, and also held regular naval exercises, which seemed to Castro at least to threaten U.S. invasion. So it's in this context that of the broader Cold War, and then of this antagonistic relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, that Castro and Khrushchev formed this close relationship, right? So Castro, one second here, let me go back to my, let me just get back to the PowerPoint, sorry, bear with me one second here. There we go. So, Castro and Khrushchev formed this very close relationship. Castro, in an effort to try to fend off what he sees as the threats in the United States, and Khrushchev to, score points, if you will, against U.S. interests in Latin America. Khrushchev committed himself to supporting what he called wars of national liberation worldwide, right? Helping people fighting against Western interests in Africa and Asia and Latin America, people who claim to be fighting against what they saw as American imperialism. Khrushchev was committed to helping. And so Khrushchev and Castro formed quite a bond, and it's in this context that Khrushchev then sends these missiles to Cuba. Now here, there's a little bit of context required to understand why Nikita Khrushchev sent nuclear missiles to Cuba and essentially set off this crisis. In the 1950s, the United States and Cuba were locked in an arms race, a nuclear arms race. Both sides had developed nuclear weapons after World War II. Both sides were developing increasingly sophisticated ways of delivering these weapons through guided missiles. And in the late 1950s, the Soviets had been the first to develop what are called intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles which can travel across continents, and so one that could travel from Russia to hit the United States. The U.S. responded by increasing its intercontinental ballistic missile program, and the U.S. already had a very sophisticated intermediate range missile program. These are missiles which can travel within continents, right? So by the early 1960s, the U.S. had a much superior missile arsenal, right? There was one point the U.S. feared there was a missile gap which favored the Soviets. By the early 1960s, it was clear that there was a missile gap, but that it favored the United States significantly. So part of what Khrushchev was doing by sending these missiles to Cuba was supporting the Cuban Revolution, defending Castro, but he was also trying to equalize the advantage that the United States had in terms of missiles, particularly those intermediate range missiles which the United States had in Europe. And so this was a chance for the Soviets to put missiles in the Western Hemisphere, which could, at much lower cost than those intercontinental ballistic missiles, be aimed directly at American cities, right? So as you can see in the slide, we can see images of photographs taken by U-2 spy planes over Cuba showing these silos under construction, and then in the map you can see the range of some of these missiles. When these missiles were discovered by the United States in October 1962, this is what set off the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now in the slide I've indicated that there are a number of different ways of looking at this crisis. For the United States, it is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis is that the Soviet Union placed what the U.S. considered offensive missiles in Cuba. Right? For the Cubans, however, this episode is referred to as the October Crisis because for them, the missiles were a defense against what they saw as an ongoing crisis, that is, U.S. efforts to overthrow the Castro regime. So this was just one phase, 1 month in a longer crisis as far as Cuba was concerned. For the Soviets, it was the Caribbean crisis. This was their effort to exert themselves into a region where they had no previous influence, and so they refer to it by geography. What happened as far as the United States are concerned? Well, John F. Kennedy found out about this on October 15th, and for the next 13 days, he and his cabinet and a wider range of advisors explored every possible angle in terms of how to resolve this crisis. Kennedy had warned Khrushchev early on not to put offensive weapons in Cuba, and so he was shocked and angered to find that Khrushchev had done so. He called together his cabinet and he called together a team of advisors, which included, Joint Chiefs of Staff, broad range of military advisors, former Secretary of State, and together they were known as EXCOM, right? The Executive Committee on the Cuban Missile Crisis. They met continuously for 13 days to try to resolve this crisis. From the very beginning, now there's two phases. I think it's important to point out. There are two phases in this crisis as far as the United States are concerned. There's a private phase, that is from the 15th to the 22nd, for 7 days, nobody outside of EXCOM in the United States knew what was happening, right? Now, some people in the media did, but this was a period where the media didn't publish stories unless particularly if they're national security stories, if the White House didn't want them published, right? So it was kept secret for 7 days until Kennedy had a handle on what he was going to do, and then he went public. So the second phase of the crisis is the public phase, which I'll talk about in a second. In the private phase, the first 7 days, there was this heavy debate between hawks and doves, right? The hawks were people who favored a military action against Cuba, that is, using air power to take out these missile sites, using the Navy perhaps to invade Cuba, using this as a broader opportunity to take out Castro altogether. This was problematic from a number of perspectives because it likely would have escalated into conflict, broader conflict, given the fact that there were already Soviet personnel on the ground who would be killed. This argument was made by a group of people called the Doves within EXCOM, who argued that it would be much better to try to find a solution short of direct military action, right? They favored some kind of diplomacy, but the problem with diplomacy was the U.S. needed leverage to be able to get the Soviets to talk and to get them to make concessions, right? So first they talked about airstrikes against invasion. Kennedy and his closest advisors rejected that. Then they moved towards what was known as a blockade, right? This would be getting the U.S. Navy to create a ring around Cuba and stop any further Soviet supplies from arriving on the island. Problem with this is that it is officially an act of war, and the Soviets would have been, under international law, justified in taking military action in response. So Kennedy went for this option, but he called it a quarantine. And at the same time, he opened negotiations with the Soviets. So this brings us into the next phase of the public phase, right? So Kennedy went public, made a speech on television indicating that there was only one option here: the Soviets had to remove those weapons, and that he was instituting this quarantine and giving them some time to decide if they were going to remove them, and if they didn't, then the United States would take further military action. So it was very clever use of his options by Kennedy. The problem now was that there was no direct line of communication with Moscow. There were no formal lines of communication. So Kennedy had to use back channels. He had to use his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to talk to people in the press, who talked to Soviet agents. He had people talking to the Soviet ambassador. Khrushchev at the same time also put out these public letters indicating his willingness to negotiate, and then a second letter indicating his willingness not to. So Kennedy was very confused about what the Soviet position was. Eventually, what they decided to do was offer an olive branch, right? So Kennedy offered to take out U.S. missiles that were in Turkey if the Soviet Union took out its missiles in Cuba. Kennedy, however, was not willing to go public with this because that would appear that the United States was giving in to some kind of blackmail by the Soviet Union. So this deal was struck in secret. Khrushchev, who by this time realized that his only choice was to escalate, and that choice would lead to nuclear war. Kennedy had already realized this himself, and so both sides agreed to back down, accept this secret deal. Khrushchev pulled the missiles out of Cuba, and Kennedy publicly committed the United States to not overthrowing Castro. So over the course of this 13 days, the world came extremely close to an all-out nuclear war, which probably would have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, and for all intents and purposes, would have created a post-apocalyptic situation, which the world was just not prepared for. So Kennedy, and to a lesser degree Khrushchev, because Khrushchev really escalated the crisis, but Kennedy deserves a lot of credit, and his advisors deserve a lot of credit for devising a means to get out of this. The upshot of this is twofold. One, the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes this kind of case study, which is used again and again for crisis management in highly charged national security situations. But it also led to a rethinking about nuclear weapons. And so in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the United States and the Soviet Union began to try to limit their nuclear arsenals, or at least limit the process of proliferation. They stopped testing these weapons above ground, and then stopped testing them in the oceans, and in the case of the US, eventually stopped testing them altogether. By the 1970s, they had agreed to start cutting certain categories of weapons. They also got many countries to sign a Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, which is still kind of the basis for stopping countries like Iran and North Korea from nuclearizing today. So it's an extremely important event. It's got massive implications on many levels. And of course, it had legacy also for the Cuban people, because Castro remained in power and the United States was committed not to getting rid of him. So the relationship remained strained, but the two countries remained as they were, if you will, before 1962. So that's my brief overview. I hope you found some use in this presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions or address questions if you have them.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kilroy. That was a great overview of the situation. And our first question comes from Donna, who asks, why wasn't there a hotline phone to avoid miscommunication?
That's a great question. And one of the very first things that happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis is the ubiquitous red phone is installed in both the White House and the Kremlin, so that whoever is president of the United States could pick up the phone and have the leader of the Soviet Union on the line straight away. So obviously that is, the absence of that hotline was one of the lessons learned, right? The part of the reason this came so close to all-out nuclear war was because there was a lack of understanding and a lack of empathy and a lack of clear communication. Kennedy and Khrushchev came to see this during the course of the crisis. They came to see that empathy was one of the things they were both lacking. They, a lot of scholars talk about, mirror imaging and Kennedy having expectations of Khrushchev, that Khrushchev would think and act the way he did, the way Kennedy did, and that Khrushchev the same way was trying to understand Kennedy only from his own perspective, right? Trying to think that Kennedy's next move would reflect the way he would act in the same situation. And I think what they both came to realize was that they had to try to put themselves in each other's shoes. They had to try to understand themselves not from their own perspectives, but from the perspective of the Soviet Union or the United States. And what they lacked was that kind of personal understanding. And so having these more direct line of communications was one way in which you could avoid some of the misunderstandings which these crises tend to throw up. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that for a president of the United States in this situation, they have a lot of different advisors giving a lot of different advice. A lot of people are giving them different interpretations of what they think Khrushchev might be doing or the Russians might be thinking. And to have that direct line of communication allows the president to make some clearer understanding, to arrive at some clearer understanding by just simply picking up that phone and asking some of those hard questions of their counterpart. So that's a fantastic question. And I think it is one of the lessons learned from this crisis that, we see, for example, today that part of the tensions with North Korea or with Iran, they're exacerbated because there are less direct lines of communication. And as we're seeing, with North Korea, for example, when there's more effort made to communicate directly, there seems to be more opportunity for resolving some of these crises before they become acute. So, good question.
Yes, thank you for that question, Donna. And I have a question, which is, you had said that in Cuba, this event is known as the October Crisis. I'm curious, outside of the government, how did this event play out with the public, and how much were people even aware of what was going on back then, given the government control of the media?
Yeah, no, great question. The Cuban public were not nearly as aware as the American public were. At least not initially. Having said that, once Kennedy went public, all Americans were unaware of it until Kennedy went public on October 22nd, right? Once Kennedy went public, news began to filter down, I think, from the exile community in Florida to people on the island. And of course, I think a lot of ordinary Cubans were aware of the Soviet presence, right? You don't send these missiles down without, creating some kind of signal that they're there, right? So, Khrushchev had hoped to get these missiles into Cuba secretly, and they tried to disguise them on ships coming down towards Cuba as, farm equipment and various other things. The U.S. knew that there were weapons going in, and so too did most Cubans, right? And there were a lot of Soviet personnel on the ground in Cuba. So ordinary Cubans were aware that something was going on. And particularly in those regions where the silos were being built, very hard to move these missile parts, down rural roads without people seeing what's happening. So the basic answer to your question is that I would say ordinary people in Cuba were certainly not informed by their government of what was happening, but they were able to surmise it from their own observations, and particularly once Kennedy went public, I think news about the extent of the crisis and the reaction in the United States became apparent. I think one interesting thing to point out here too, and I think, Chris, you're right. There's, and this is true of all governments. There's always a gap between government view and popular view. But in the case of Cuba, that gap was exacerbated to some extent. And Castro certainly, emerges from this crisis as, arguably the person who's least alarmed by the implications of what's happening, right? Castro was extremely angry with Khrushchev for removing these weapons, and he said later in the 90s when they held meetings with, to try to talk through these things in the aftermath of the Cold War, that he would have been likely to have ordered their use, right? The Cubans did shoot down an American U-2 plane during the crisis, and almost set it off. So Cuban government was more militant than any participant, I think. And the Cuban people, it's hard to get a sense because of the secrecy, but I think they knew what was going on, at least to a certain degree.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer. That definitely is what I was looking for. And our next question says, with the National Security Affairs and International Relations Program, does it work with issues that are current as well as past events, including what we've learned from previous situations and how we have implemented what we've learned from recent events?
Well, the program is it's a mix of disciplines, right? So there are courses that take a historical perspective. I teach a U.S. Foreign policy course, which tends to look at U.S. foreign policy going back to 1945, when the national security state was essentially created during the early Cold War. And then we have a lot of contemporary classes. We have a current issues class, which looks at current issues. We have an IR class, which takes current issues to teach students how international relations theory operates and is applied. And then, of course, we have other disciplines which look at the legal aspects of national security. We have an ethics course which looks at the ethics of these decision-making processes. The program is primarily focused on contemporary issues, but you can't have an understanding of contemporary issues without that historical context.
Absolutely. And next we have Raphael, who says, "Thank you, Dr. Kilroy, for the presentation. How was the Cuban Missile Crisis perceived abroad in the international community and in the Soviet Union?"
Excellent question. One of the things Kennedy had to do once he went public on this crisis was inform his allies of his intentions, right? So he had to work closely with the French and the British, his key European allies, to make sure that they were on board. Kennedy also tried to use the Organization of American States, the international body that involved all Latin American states and North American states, to try to isolate Cuba as a kind of quote-unquote bad actor in this crisis. And Kennedy also used the UN as a vehicle to try to admonish the Soviets and build a kind of a broad international coalition of opinion, at least, against Soviet action. I think in terms of how the rest of the world reacted, most of America's allies came to its support and saw the United States saw Soviet action as provocative, and the U.S. actions as justified and largely defensive. But I think there was also a sense of deep alarm, that fear that the United States might act aggressively and set off this cycle of events which could lead to nuclear war. So in terms of the Soviet Union, of course, like Cuba, the Soviet public was largely kept in the dark about what was happening. Certainly weren't given the same level of information that people in the United States got. And for many Soviets, the Caribbean crisis was something distant, which was not nearly as dangerous as they weren't led to believe, at least, was as dangerous as it actually was. In terms of Soviet leadership, it proved to be a disastrous gamble by Khrushchev, because he came out of it looking relatively weak in the Soviet Union, and he was eventually eased out of power and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced him as Soviet leader in the mid-1960s.
All right. Well, we're going to move on now to the admissions portion of our presentation. So if you have any questions about the admissions process, you can type them in the chat, and Jessica Hubble from our team will answer them. And if you have any questions specifically about the NSA IR program, I will direct them here to Dr. Kilroy to answer. So let me just switch here. Okay. So our admissions process, you start by applying at nova.edu. There's a $50 application fee. We need, as part of your application, your academic transcripts from every college that you attended for your undergraduate program or any other degrees. We need a personal statement between 500 and 1,000 words, and the idea of this is to explain and capture why you're interested in this program and what your objectives are, what you hope to get out of the program. We need a sample of academic writing. This could be a paper from a specific course, so dig into your archives for that. We need 2 letters of recommendation, and we're looking for primarily academic recommendations from maybe past professors that you've had and can speak to your ability to handle a graduate program and all of the coursework and responsibility that that entails. We need a resume or a CV. And then there is going to be an interview process based on a review of your materials. On this screen here is the 3 deadline dates for the 3 semesters and when you need to have all of your materials in. And we, of course, have more information available on the website. The NSU website has information about prospective international students and the resources available to you. And here is mailing address for any materials that you're going to be sending physically, as well as the email address for electronic transcripts when you order those from your institution. For more information, you can email us at gradschool@nova.edu, or you can reach us at these 2 numbers here. Affordability. You can find information about financial aid at nova.edu/financial aid. And I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides, but as you can see from these screenshots, we have scholarships that are available. We have grants. We have student employment. We have veterans benefits if you are a military veteran. So you can search through all of these different options and find something that will work for you that's applicable. And we do have payment plans that are available that we will work with you on. And getting started, you apply for Federal Student Aid ID, and then you fill out the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. If you've gone through undergraduate programs in the US, then you're familiar with both of these. And here is the contact information for financial aid if you have any additional questions. So at this time, if you have any questions about the NSA IR program for Dr. Kilroy, I'd be happy to answer them. And if you have any questions about the admissions process, you can direct them to Jessica in the chat. And as a further note, this presentation has been recorded. We will make it available within a few days on our website, and that link will be emailed out to all attendees if you want to refer back to a part of the lecture, or if you want to tell a friend about it, you can give them that link. And of course, after the presentation is over, you can still contact us at gradschool.nova.edu or by phone at 954-262-7563. Let me go back to that slide. And the 800 version of that number, 800-541-6682, extension 27563. And don't see any questions yet. We will hang around for just a few minutes. But in the meantime, Dr. Kilroy, could you talk a bit more about this upcoming trip to Cuba?
Yes, so this is a travel study course, a special topics course on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we will be spending the whole semester studying what I just ran through in 25 minutes. And we'll be obviously therefore deep diving into a lot of these issues, and students will be doing their own research, and of course we will have a period midway through the semester where we will travel to Havana, and also do a day trip out from Havana to the Bay of Pigs. So while we're in Havana, we will be staying with local families, and we will be getting lectures and from people on the ground. We'll also be visiting significant sites in Havana and around the area pertinent to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also to broader U.S.-Cuban relations. So several museums and regions of the city, and as I say, further afield. You know, this is an exciting opportunity. It's an example of the range of options and opportunities that students in the program have. We have several students signed up for this course next semester, and they're all really excited to go. So hopefully, if any of you join the program in the near future, we'll have similar travel study courses available.
Great. And I know you've done a lot of travel study courses in the past. So what do you think are some of the benefits of it, and what can students get out of participating in such a course?
Sure. Well, you know, it's very hard to get a sense of a place from a book or from readings or from lectures. Being there is no substitute for it, right? So I think students traveling to a destination that we're studying and reading about get a real sense of the culture, of the issues, of the landscape, of the social and political dynamic of the area, and then they can apply that. They can, it allows for greater depth in terms of readings. It gives them greater context in terms of their own analysis. And so, I think anyone who's traveled understands this, right? That there is a real education.
Sure, they changed it now, those bastards.
So I think, it is hugely beneficial, and something, particularly in a field like this, where if you want to deal in international relations, particularly, but even in American national security, defined more narrowly, you have to have a sense of the cultures and the countries that you deal with on a daily basis.
Great. Well, I don't see any additional questions. Oh, wait a second. The question here, is this a normal occurrence to travel during this program?
Well, actually, this is a first time that we're trying travel study within this program. So in our undergraduate programs, we do a lot of travel study. There's been travel study courses in the past in our undergraduate programs within our department to Eastern Europe, to Ireland, to Latin America, to the UK. And so it's a model we're familiar with in terms of executing it. It's just not something we've opened to graduate students before. So we were really excited when we did this special topics course to see so much interest from the students in our program. I think there's a lot of excitement about this opportunity. And as I say, given that excitement, I think it's something we will be doing again in the future.
Well, I'm hopeful it'll be a great experience for everyone. I'm sure it will be. So I think we have reached the end of our questions. And just as a note for all of our attendees, whether you are here right now or watching the recording, if you go to nova.edu/DRA, you can see an archive of past webinars, and you can also register for upcoming webinars to find out more from our diverse programs, to hear from faculty like Dr. Kilroy, who obviously have lots of experience in their fields of expertise. So we hope that you have enjoyed this webinar, and thank you for attending. So again, we'll have this up in a few days at that website, nova.edu/DRA. So thank you and have a good evening.
Chris, before you go, I just realized I mistyped my